In the last video, we discussed on duration and period. Duration and period are used to represent the time span. Durations are fixed length, time in seconds. Periods are designed to match human concept of time span. If you want to learn more on durations and periods, you can refer to my earlier video. The link you will find in the description below. In this video, we will cover the third option to store the time span, the interval. Interval is a duration with specific start and end date. Lubridate package comes with helper functions that work with interval. With these helper functions, you can perform the operations on the interval, such as you can retrieve the amount of time interval covers, either as duration or period. You can test whether another date time is in the interval, or you can test whether two intervals overlap. We are going to perform these operations on intervals and in process learn some of the helpful helper functions. So let's get started. We'll start with loading the tidyverse library. Now the data set that we will use in this video is a list of 14 prime ministers India has had since independence. It has the name of prime minister and its term in the office. We will use this data set to create an interval and perform some operations on it. So let's first create the interval using interval function. Now there are two arguments that you need to supply to the interval function. The time 1, which is start of the interval, and time 2, which is end of the interval. Please note that we have used the dply parsing function because from date and to date, which comes from our data set, have character class and not date class. So we will have to convert those variables from character class into a date class. There is also alternate way of creating the interval. You can use %, %% operator to create the interval. So the interval can be created both ways, using interval function or using %, %% operator. Now we have created the interval. Let's use wide range of helper functions to operate on intervals. We can extract the start date and end date of the interval using int_start and int_end functions. We'll have to supply the interval name as an argument to these functions. You can see the start date and end date of each interval in separate columns. You can also find out the length of the interval using int_length function. Int_length function finds the length of the interval in seconds. Length of an interval can also be calculated in period. You can use as.period function to calculate the interval period. Similarly, length of an interval can also be calculated in duration. You can use as.duration function to calculate the interval duration. We can check whether date time falls within the range of an interval. So let's create some date time objects. Now what I've done here, I've created a date object which marks the major events in India after independence. 3 events are marked. The first event, India World Cup cricket. This object represents a date on which India won its first ever cricket World Cup, beating West Indies by 43 runs. The final was played at Lord's Cricket Ground. The second object, India Economic Reforms. represents a date of historical budget speech by then Finance Minister of India, Mr. Manmohan Singh. In this speech, he laid out a new trade policy oriented towards promoting exports and removing import controls. It enabled India to open its economic borders to foreign investments and MNCs. And the third object, India-Kargil War, is in fact interval. And during this interval, India fought a Kargil war against Pakistan. The war took place in Kargil district of Jammu and Kashmir to flush out the Pakistan army from Indian territory. So now our task is to check who was the incumbent Prime Minister when these events took place. So let's answer the first question. Who was the incumbent Prime Minister when India won the World Cup? So to compare a date time to an interval, we have to use percent within percent operator. It will return true if date time is inside the interval and false otherwise. Now, since we want to extract out the specific rows from the data set, we will subset the data frame India_PM and use the Boolean output from percent within percent operator to filter out the row. So when India won the World Cup, Indira Gandhi was the incumbent Prime Minister. Coming to the second question, who was the incumbent Prime Minister when India ushered into the era of economic reforms? Again, we will use the percent within percent operator. P.V. Narasimha Rao was the incumbent Prime Minister when India entered into the era of economic reforms. Who was the incumbent Prime Minister when Kargil War was fought between India and Pakistan? Now in this case, we are comparing two intervals. Office_interval is one interval and India_Kargil_war is the second interval. So we are comparing two intervals here. Okay. So in this case, we will have to use int_overlaps function and it will return true if there is overlap and it will return false if there is no overlap. So as you can see, when the Kargil war was happening, India had 3 prime ministers. So let's summarize quickly. Interval is a duration with specific start and end date. Lubridate package comes with many helper functions to work with intervals. To create the interval, use interval function and pass on start date and end date of the interval as an arguments. The interval can also be created with %_% operator. int_start and int_end functions are used to extract the start date and end date of the interval. int_period will return interval length in periods and int_duration will return the interval length in duration. Remember, for duration it means in seconds. To compare a date time to an interval, we use percent within percent operator. It will return true if date time is inside the interval and false otherwise. To compare two intervals, we have used int_interval function, which will return true if there are any times that are inside both intervals. Right, so we have come to the end of the video. The intervals are so important and they are so common data structures that you will find while working with the time series data. So small homework for you, pull out any time series data and play around with these interval functions. Visit the web page of lubridate API, lubridate.tidyverse.org, and find out more interesting stuff to work with the date time object. Keep on doing experimentation and practice. This is the sure short way to become master in the R language. Thanks for watching it till end. I will appreciate if you can post your comments or suggestions in the comment section of this video. Do also subscribe to the channel so that you will get immediate notifications on all the upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon.